A while back, I was looking at the du'as I made, and I realized that I was kind of just making mechanical du'as, and you probably have the same thing. Like, you probably memorized a couple of du'as, maybe when you were a child or when you were small. And basically, all you were taught was just go recite this du'a in the morning, go recite that du'a in the evening. And you don't really have a connection to the du'a. You do it just because, that's what you're supposed to do. But bro, what I realized is this is the complete opposite of how we should approach du'a. Du'a is going to be useless if you come at it from a completely mechanical perspective. It has to be attached to the heart, because think about it, like you're literally asking Allah. So the more I started to research into dua and this stuff, I realized, bro, there's so much stuff with dua that people just don't teach you. And I remember specifically learning 2 phrases, and these 2 phrases you probably already know, but implementing these after my duas pretty much made them guaranteed. It was honestly surprising. It was as soon as I say it, it immediately happens. Now these 2 phrases, I'll touch upon what they are later in the video, but first thing, you have to understand there's so many secrets in the Quran. See, what a lot of people do, and be honest, there's a good chance this is you, is they just read the Quran without any translation, without understanding, and especially without reflecting and pondering. Allah all throughout the Quran tells us that this book is to ponder upon. It's not just to pick up and read after Fajr for 15 minutes every day just because, your mom told you to do that. But rather, it's to actually extract the information, and you only do that by pondering on it. A lot of people just read the Quran, and they're not using their brains, they're not thinking. But look, this is literally the speech of Allah. I mean, look, if you take any other book, like a normal book, it's going to have hidden themes and messages and things that if you ponder upon, you'll get extra insights. And those are books made by humans. The Quran was revealed by Allah. So imagine how many gems and lessons and extra little pieces of information you can extract just by pondering and thinking about what Allah is actually saying. So anyway, I was looking at this specific verse in the Quran, which is chapter 38, verse 34. And in this verse, it says, وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّا سُلَيْمَانَ وَأَلْقَيْنَا عَلَى كُرْسِيِّهِ جَسَدًا ثُمَّ أَنَابَ. And in English, what it means is basically we tested Solomon by placing a deformed body on his throne, and then Solomon repented and turned back to Allah. Now pay attention to the next verse after this. In the next verse, Solomon actually makes a dua. And this dua was not like any ordinary dua. See, what he asked for was to have a kingdom that no one else in history had. And this was a dua that Allah actually accepted. And you might say, well, there's billionaires now. There's almost trillionaires now. So how can we say Solomon was the richest? Well, what Sulaiman alayhi salam had was control over the jinns and control over the wind, which people nowadays, of course, we don't have that. So this is something special Allah granted Sulaiman alayhi salam. So obviously, everybody makes dua for wealth and success. At least, I hope I'm not the only person who does that. And Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam was granted the most of this out of anybody else in the world because of this dua. So we could actually analyze this dua and see what he did specifically. Now, there are many parts to it, but I see 3 things in specific. First of all, it was done after a fitna. Now, the fitna for Prophet Sulaiman ﷺ was that he wanted an heir, and his wife basically gave birth to a dead and deformed baby. So this is the first thing, which is your du'as are way more likely to be accepted if it's after a fitna. Now, the second thing is, before Prophet Sulaiman ﷺ asks for anything at all, he first makes tawbah and repentance. And this is how you should approach dua. Before you go out and ask Allah for anything at all, go make tawbah and repentance, because you're bathing in sin, and sin actually goes against your dua. Now, the third thing, and probably the most potent, is that at the end of the dua, Prophet Sulaiman ﷺ calls upon Allah's name Al-Wahhab. And that name basically means the giver of all bounties. So what you can get from the name Al-Wahhab is that Allah is capable of giving you wealth. Allah is capable of giving you a kingdom, which is why Prophet Sulaiman ﷺ specifically chose that name. And even in another verse of the Quran, it says that Allah has the most beautiful names, so you should call upon Allah by those names. This is something a lot of people miss and don't do at all, and I missed it for so long. When you make dua, call upon Allah by a certain name that makes sense with that dua. So for example, if you're asking for wealth or anything like that, Al-Wahhab literally means the giver. Or you could say Allah's name of being Khairul Raziqeen, which means the best of providers, or Zul Fadlul Azim, which means basically the haver of a great bounty. Now, what about if you want to ask Allah for knowledge? Well, Allah has the name Al-Alim, which means the most knowledgeable. And you probably know there's 99 names of Allah, and you should call upon these names when you're making dua. And specifically, the way Prophet Sulaiman ﷺ did it was he said, Innaka antal Wahhab, which means, indeed, you are the Wahhab, meaning the best of providers. So you should use this framework in your du'as. After you make whatever ask it is, say Innaka antal Wahhab, or whatever name it is. It could be, if you're getting knowledge, إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَلِيمُ. Honestly, bro, this is so simple, but I realized it made my du'as so much better and it made them hit so much harder. These three things together are kind of like a cheat code to life, and especially when you consider that most people don't even know about this. But there's even more stuff you can do. So 2 specific things which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. The 2 things are praising Allah and praising the Prophet ﷺ in specific ways. So before you start your du'a, first, send salawat upon the Prophet ﷺ. And this is actually a hadith that Allah is too generous to not accept the dua made between 2 salawats. Meaning, you start with the salawat and you make the dua, and then at the end, you end with another salawat. And if you're wondering what that could be, it's simply Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid, and you probably know the rest. Now, after you make that first salawat, then you have to praise Allah, and specifically, you use the dua that Yunus alayhi salam used when he was in the whale. In fact, according to another hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that no one supplicates with this dua except that what he asks for will be granted to him. And this dua, if you don't know it, is La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minna zalimin. And you could actually also find this as a Quran verse. So that's a lot of stuff. So let me just put this all together. There's 7 steps in total to make a complete dua. First is making a dua after a fitna. And you should know that this is not actually necessary. Like, you can make a dua whenever you want, but it would be way better if it's, after a fitna like Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam did. And an additional note I want to add is that Prophet Dawood alayhi salam in the same chapter of the Quran actually used the exact same method, where he faced a fitna and then he repented and then he made dua and then Allah gave him a great bounty. The next part is sending salawat upon the Prophet ﷺ, and that's pretty simple. You already know how to do that. And then the next part after that is praising Allah using that specific dua that Yunus ﷺ used. Then the 4th part is you make istighfar like Prophet Sulaiman ﷺ did before he was making his ask. Then the next part 5, is basically the ask, asking Allah for whatever it might be. Wealth, success, or whatever, the girl you're trying to marry. The part after, part 6, is to call upon Allah by His name that relates to whatever you ask for. If you ask for wealth, innaka anta al-wahhab, or khairul raziqin. If you ask for strength or power, innaka anta al-qawi, for example. Look up the 99 names of Allah if you're interested, because honestly, there's something for literally everything you ask for. And then the last part, the 7th part, is closing it with salawat again, like you started it. Now, this seems like a pretty long process. In reality, it's not that long if you actually just go by it, especially if you know everything that you're supposed to do. But if you actually utilize this, you'll see that your du'as will be so much more powerful. And on top of that, your du'as are not going to be mechanical or emotionless. You're actually going to feel them in your heart, and you're going to feel them work. Now, the last point I want to mention is a small extra point about having certainty when you make du'a. Umar radiallahu anhu actually had a very interesting quote. Basically, he said, "I do not worry too much about the reply to my supplication. Instead, I only worry about the supplication itself. If the supplication is sincere, then the answer will come with it." The problem a lot of people face is they're making dua and they don't even believe that it can happen. If you make dua and you ask Allah for $1 million, but you don't actually believe Allah can give you $1 million, it's never going to happen. The reason why is because you're limiting Allah. I mean, think about it. Allah is literally limitless. He can give you any amount of money at any time He wants. So when you're not certain about a dua, when you're doubtful about it, you're basically doubting Allah's capabilities. And of course, bro, that's not where you want to go. I want you to understand this principle. If you don't have faith in your duas, it's simply not going to happen. You have to have this kind of delusional confidence in your duas. That confidence that I can ask Allah for $1 billion and He's going to give it to me. And your dua is only going to be as strong as how much faith you have in it. Let's be honest, a lot of us don't really feel like we can make $1 billion, which is why if we make dua for $1 billion, it's probably not going to be accepted. And really, I feel like this is such a true test of faith, because you have to accept and imagine that Allah has the power to give you whatever, even though it's not tangibly real. So yeah, the point is you have to be certain in your du'as and you have to have faith that they're actually going to work. If you have faith, it's guaranteed to work. So here's what I want you to do. Make a dua right now for your success, for your, grades in school, whatever you want, and use all of these things in this video. And I guarantee you, bro, inshallah, that dua will be accepted.